Hi, I'm DJ Ware. On this episode of the CyberGizmo, we're going to look at one of the most necessary things that you need to do, but a little bit differently than most people have covered this. This is about backups, but as you'll see in a minute. Stay tuned. Yeah, so one of the most important things that you can learn about is some of the different techniques that you can use to do backups. Yes, there are GUI programs that do backups of your system that are within most Linux distributions. I think SUSE, if I remember correctly, through their YAS plugins, had one of the first GUIs for backups. I could be wrong, but I do seem to remember that they were one of the first ones out of the box that provided that facility. Red Hat, of course, Fedora has backup utilities. Arch has backup utilities. But I want to look at one that you don't have to install. It's one that comes with your distribution. But before we do that, let's just take a look and talk a little bit about what kind of what kind of people in IT there are. So in information technology or in today's world of cloud. There are two kinds of people. There are those that do regular backups and those that wish they did. And the ones that wish they did seem to be more frequent these days, particularly with some of the malware and some of the encryption schemes or ransomware schemes in order to extract money from these corporations, because either they don't have adequate backups or their backups weren't encrypted and the attackers were able to encrypt those files as well. Having to use a backup is a matter of when. It's not a matter of if. Sooner or later, you will have a hardware failure, a software failure, or some bug in a software application that obliterates the system. I remember personally way back when I first started, I had a tape drive on a system that was brand new, and we had just migrated about probably close to 1 million inventory records off of their mainframe. And the backup system seemed to work fine, but you know what? Fatal error. I didn't test the restore. Bad on me. And one of my developers at the time came in, made a change, and obliterated the database. He had a command that basically did a purge on the database by dropping it. So, yeah, bad things. So we had to start that restore process over again in order to get it off of the mainframe and get it back down. That took quite a bit of time. So lessons learned, always check your restores. At least that's been one that's come with me for a long time. Make sure that there isn't a problem with the media that you've generated, whether it be, tape drives aren't used all that much today. There's probably still some in use. Particularly with some of the robot libraries, but most of the backups today go to disk. And that's important to check that because the drive can go bad in the middle of a backup and not report an error. So that's just as important as performing the backup. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to learn about how to make, query, and unpack a file archive. And you'll find out what I'm talking about there. How to make incremental backups, and there's a number of different ways you can do backups, and we'll talk a little bit about those as well. And then if you're interested in pursuing maybe a GUI backup or something like that, where would you look? Where would you look for any other solutions that might be a little easier to use than the one I'm going to show you? And then most importantly, encrypt that backup. It's very important that you do that, particularly if you're sending off from your system off to a remote system that you don't own. You don't want some system admin on that remote system to be able to just look through your data or have some kind of problem like we've seen over and over again with people storing stuff in the Amazon cloud of not securing the data systems on those cloud devices, and so people are able to get in and then they ransomware your data back to you. Not a good idea, and I don't know how many times we have to seem to learn these lessons. So there's basically 3 types of backups that you can do. First one is a full backup. That's just taking everything that is on the file system of your machine and putting it into the backup itself. Those, however, we'll talk about some of the pros and cons, and that is a good way. You always start with a full backup, no matter how long it takes. You always start with a full backup, simply because that is your point of restore. The second strategy is to use a differential backup. A differential backup is used when you have large amounts of data, say, petabytes worth of data that you're trying to save. Well, you don't have enough time in the day to be able to back up all that data. So a differential backup takes from the point of a full backup. On the second day, it adds what has changed. On the third day, it takes what changed plus what has changed on that day. So that differential gets larger and larger as time goes on. And that is one strategy. I don't know too many places that are using differential backup myself anymore. I have used those in the past when we had very slow devices to back up to. So, yeah, that's a possibility if you want to do that, but it isn't something that I have seen personally widely used too much anymore. Incremental backups, however, I seem to find more often. Those copy files that have changed since the last backup. Now, that could be a full backup or that could be an incremental. So let's say that you did a full backup once a week, and you pick, let's say, Sunday. So I do a full backup on Sunday, and then Monday I run the backup again. And this time it does not copy everything. It looks for what has changed, and then it makes just the copies of that. On the second day, when I run it, it only copies to the backup what has changed since Monday. So it already knows that there's an incremental backup there, so it only changes what's Monday and then Wednesday and Thursday. So you basically have smaller, depends how active your file system is, but you'll have smaller backups to do than you would, say, a full backup. So, but you need a snapshot. If you're using tar, and that's what we're going to be using, if you're using tar, you need a snapshot. And a snapshot in tar is basically the metadata on the files that have been copied previously. And those change incrementally over time. And I'll show you some ways that you can use that today. But let's talk a little bit about maybe some of the pros and cons. So incremental backups, there's a graph that shows you what we were talking about earlier. Start on Monday with a full backup, and then we go up over time. We add these incrementals. Pros is the incremental takes less time to perform than a differential. Yep, most definitely. You can perform it daily, hourly, even up to every minute if you want to. But it only copies the data that's changed. That's it. But the cons are you have to have all these incremental files. So if I get to Saturday over here and I have a failure, I have to have all of these to be able to restore. Plus, I have to have the SNAR file or the snapshot file of the archive in order to be able to restore. If I don't have that, I can't restore. So, yeah, this gets a little wieldy to try to track and keep. I mean, you need to keep all of these as you go forward. Now, one of the other things is differential. And the pros of that are, of course, it's faster than a full copy. And it does take less space than a daily full backup, of course. But the differential files grow each day. So, as you can see, Monday's changes are here. Tuesday plus Monday's changes are here. And so forth. Wednesday plus Tuesday plus Monday. Yeah, I think you get the idea that but you only have to, in a differential, you don't have to have as many files to track for that. So performing incremental backups is what we're going to look at today. So I'm going to use the tar command. It used to be called the tape archive utility. Today, Linux calls it an archiving utility, which is probably more accurate, because we just don't have tape drives anymore. There was another one called CPIO, and that was copy IO, input output. So the copy IO isn't used much anymore, but in the old days, the tar systems and the CPIO systems were not compatible with other systems. So if I was moving data from, let's say, an AT&T 3B2 and I wanted to move it over to an HPUX system, I had to make sure that I had a mechanism that the archive format would be compatible with HPs. And we ran into that a lot. Now, GNU changed a lot of that because when they started writing software, they standardized everything. And so if you have GNU tar, and most of the Linux systems do, I'm not aware of any that don't, you can rest assured that that data is transportable not only between other versions of Linux, but also other versions of BSD. So yeah, it's not as big an issue as it once was. But if you want to make sure that you can always do a tar minus version, and you can find out whether or not you're using GNU tar and what version of GNU tar that you're using to make sure that it is compatible. I haven't seen any of this incompatibility in a long, long time, but I do remember it. So let's talk about the steps. So you create a full backup no matter what. That's where your starting point is, and you always do that on whatever period of backups you're going to do. So let's say they're doing it weekly. You start on a Sunday, you do a full backup. Now, by what I define a full backup, that might be just selected file systems. You don't have to back up everything on your system. If it's distribution files and distribution libraries, I mean, you can easily restore the system if you had to, right? And you're probably going to have to anyway. If you lost a boot drive, you're going to have a USB key that you can at least boot the system up even to be able to get to these tar files. So, yeah, I might do backups on the distribution files, but I would definitely do Etsy, and I would definitely do var, and I would definitely do the home directories. And if I had any special applications, I would probably do that one too. And then it depends on where your data is stored as to what other things you want to do. And if you're in a database, are you dumping the database first to a file? Or I mean, it isn't advisable that you copy database files because inside of there is a date and timestamp. And if those get out of sync, such as if the database is running and you do a copy of it, when you go to restore that, your database may not open. So most people do a dump on their databases, so they get around that problem. And then you would take that dump and then copy it someplace. But when you create a full backup, that's called a level 0 backup in tar, and that will create the active snapshot or the SNAR file. The secondary level is a level 1 backup, and that's the increment. And that will take the SNAR file that's in place, and it will just append the changes to it on the files, and then it will create a new archive. You have to tell it what archive build. Don't overwrite the one that had the full in it. But I think probably it'd be better to just show you. Let's hop down. Let's hop down into a terminal window and take a look. So I have a directory here that has some shell scripts in it, and let's start out with I'm going to back up my opt directory, and this is the command for it. I think that's going to show. Yeah, looks like it will. So I have the tar command right here, and I'm using the long form of the command so that you can follow along with this. -- create, and then I'm going to create an archive called archive.1.tar. Now, probably if I'm following a incremental plan that on a weekly basis, that would be Sunday. I would probably say sunday.tar. And then this is the name of my SNAR file, or the snapshot archive file. And that gets created separately. Just remember that when you're storing these files offline and you're moving them, don't forget to pick up your SNAR file, because without that, you don't have the metadata you need in order to restore. And then the name of the directory, and that's it. So let's go ahead and run this. It has to be sudo. Okay. So you'll notice some tar commands come in, some tar thing. It says it's removing the / from member names. And also, it's also telling me it has a sock file that's out there, and sock files I don't care about, because that'll get recreated when the VPN restarts anyway. So there's my archive, and that is a full archive. I can do. I use tar commands. T is for test. In other words, I want to test the archive. So this is how you make sure that your archive is valid. It also lists, because I'm doing verbose, it's also going to list the files in there, which is the V command. And then the F says, what file do you want to open? Where is your tar archive? So you'll notice here that a couple of things. You'll notice that this is what it meant by removing the leading slash. This makes the tar file relocatable. So I could push opt under any directory I want, or I can put it back in its original position under root. I prefer to do it this way because sometimes if I'm migrating things, I might have a dump that's larger than I want to migrate, so I might want to select through there. So what I'll do is I'll just create a temp directory, dump all this in there, and then I'll pick and choose what files out of the dump I want. I mean, so that's why I do it that way. But you may want to include the slash, and there is a command to do that. We'll cover that today, but I'll probably put something in the show notes below. So, okay, so we've got the archive. Let's look at varlog, and let's look for snar. And there's my snar file. This is, as I said, this is the snapshot file that has the metadata for the archive in it. And so let's go ahead and look at. Let's say that I want to, let's make some changes to op. So I'm going to copy some shell files over to op bash, which is a directory called our backup. So I want to preserve that, and I didn't have anything in there previously, but I now want to run an incremental. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm not doing anything different other than naming a new archive. And this would be, let's say this was Monday, right? So this would be Monday's our incremental. You would have one of these files for every day. You'd have a file equal Monday and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and so on, right? And then same, it looks the same, no difference between the full backup and this one, except when you run it. It ran pretty quick, didn't it? And you'll notice that the archive file is a lot smaller. And so why do you think that is? Well, and the other thing is, let's see, on my snarf, I probably don't have it, but my snar file is still there, but it's grown a little bit. So if I do a tar, I'm just going to see the files that changed, right? No, you're going to see all of them. And that's because of the snar file, is that it will show all of those files that are there. But here's the but. In order for this to work, both of these files have to be here. And if they're not, I'm dead. I can't, right? So I can't do anything with it. Let's say that I want to look at, I want more details. I don't know what files it backed up. I want to find out, right? So you can do that with a tar command. And again, I'm using the long form. It's -- list, which says to list the contents of the archive. I want the incremental, as I want to know about the incremental. So the first verbose is about the files that are listed in the archive. The second verbose has to do with the incremental. So I want to know about, I want more information about the files that are in the archive, and I want more information about the incremental. And then again, this file command just tells me where to start. Now, I'm just going to start with archive 2. I'm not going to look at, yeah, I'm not going to look at, sorry about that. I clicked off the screen. So let's go ahead and run this. Again, sudo, because they're owned by root. And we'll do the list increment. But probably I should do this with a more first, huh? So whenever you're doing it this way, the first thing it does is it'll do the verbose on the snar. So it's going to tell me, it's going to tell me this is the starting point for the archive. And this op directory contains these directories. So there's backup, Google, Linus, Play VPN, Resolve, and Zoom. And then down here, you'll start to see, okay, in the backup directory, I have these files. And what is this Y doing here? Well, the Y means that these files are in the archive2 directory. That's all it means, is that I can find these in archive2. So let's go down a little bit and take a look at some of the others. So here's Google Chrome. There's a lot of directories, and you'll notice an N this time. N means this file is not contained in archive2, which means it has to be in archive1, right? And so on and so forth. Now, when you get, although sooner or later, we're going to get to where the files start to actually show up in the archive. So I'm just going to spin up through this. And this is actually listed in the SNAR file at this point. But there's the changes right there, and for the files that are in here. So you'll notice that I only had a little bit of information about the SNAR and only the files that were backed up. So that's all there is to that. That's so let's go back and talk about some other things. Oh, where I went off the rails. Okay, so you can get information about other backup programs. You can look at your distro notes. You can go out to the manual for your distro site. If you're using GNOME, there's a utility for that. If you're using KDE Plasma, there's a backup utility there. I'm not going to cover all those because there's really an awful lot of them. And I really wanted to show you one that was inbuilt. That tar is inbuilt to every distro. So if you start up your distro, tar is going to be on the command line for you. You don't have to install anything. Now, the other one is rsync. And rsync is the one I prefer to use. And I'll talk about that sometime in a future video. rsync automatically does either, if the directory on the target, so you have a source directory and a target directory in rsync. Source directory is the files you want to copy. The target directory is where you want to put them. If that target directory is empty, rsync automatically does a full backup. And then in the next time you run rsync, it will look at the files that are stored in the target, and if they're older than the files in the source, or the source has files that the target doesn't have, then rsync will go ahead and just copy those over. I'm going to do that in a later video. rsync can also be run over a network using SSH, which encrypts the transfer of the data over. It does not encrypt the data that's stored disk, however. So you're still responsible for encrypting that data before you actually do the rsync. But rsync will encrypt it while it's in transit. So encryption is usually done at rest, which means that you encrypt the files that are being written to disk, that have been written to disk, and the files are then closed. And then you encrypt those to protect them while they're sitting on the drive. Encryption and transit means that I'm encrypting data between a source computer and a destination computer. That way it can't be intercepted or read or any of that kind of stuff while it's being moved across the wire. Okay, great. I can encrypt my data, but how do I do that? So let's spend a few moments talking about that. And I'll go back to the browser here, or back to, the shell. Oops. Now, I think I'm going to do both of these files. But the first thing you need to do is a GPG. See if you have any keys that you have created. I already do. I'll include a link to the instructions for creating the keys. That's a little bit beyond what I really want to cover today. But once you've created keys, you can then use them to, this would be both the private and the public key. So there's my public key right here. So that anyone could use that and decrypt files that would be able to encrypt files they wanted to send to me. Only the private key can decrypt. So let's do that. So I have a script that I wrote. It's not really much of a script, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this key, my private key. I'm going to encrypt, I'm going to sign, I'm going to armor, and I'm going to use the Pi localhost, which is the right here. And then I want to encrypt archive 1 and archive 2. Now, this will take a while because I'm converting this to ASCII. That's allowed that the files will be encrypted, but they're encrypted in ASCII so that I can move them across the network. All right. To somebody that maybe doesn't have the same encoding mechanism as my machine has. And I have to be sudo again to do this. Oh, I'm probably going to have to be out here, aren't I? Okay. Let's try that again. Nope. I'll be right back. So yeah, I found it. It was just a loose nut on the keyboard. You don't want to be sudo to do that because then it looks for the keys in the root directory. You want your keys that are coming from yours. So it's running right now. This will take some time in order for it to complete. So I'm going to stop here and we'll be right back. So as you can see, it's done. And what it has done here is it's created an ASCII file. So I could go ahead and I could read this. And it does have an indication that this is encrypted. This is encrypted data, but it is an ASCII. It would move to just about any system that I can think of to move it to without any problems going over the network. But it is rather large if you do it this way. So what about decrypting? So decrypting, you don't have, oh, by the way, when you do the encryption, it'll start that process, and as it closes the file in order to sign it, it's going to ask you for your passcode for your private key. And so you'll just put that in, and then and that process will complete. For the decrypt, I'm just going to say decrypt and give it the archive name, which is this file right here. And then I'm going to just pipe it over to, or write standard out to junk.tar. So I won't make the mistake of using the sudo again. So yeah, it's showing me that it knows that it's encrypted with this key, and it's going ahead and using that particular key in order to decrypt the file. This as well, it'll take some time as well, but I don't think it takes quite as much time as it does to encrypt. I'll go ahead and pause it, and then I'll come back when it's done. Okay, so that's all done, and now I have junk.tar, but will that file, can I use it? Will that work? Let's find out. Yes, tar recognizes it. So I have encrypted and successfully decrypted my file. So I guess the other thing we need to do here is this is kind of talk about and wrap this up. So what we learned today was we learned a little bit about the backup file, the backup utilities that you have that's already installed on your machine. You don't have to do anything else with them. I will put my shell scripts up and I'll put a link to them where you can find those so that you can use mine if you want to use that as a basis for going forward. By the way, you can go to the GNU page on tar. If you put in GNU tar incremental backups, they'll have those very same commands in there. So you could do it that way as well. The thing to remember though is that when you're doing incremental backups, you need to save all of the incremental files plus the SNAR, and you need to make sure that your scripts are written for each period that you're going to collect increments for, whether that be hours or week or days. But you need to have scripts that create new archive files. Otherwise, you'll be overriding your full backup. So if I were to run an incremental against archive.1.tar and the SNAR file was available, it would just overwrite my full backup. And that's not good. You would then lose your backup. So yeah, I might cover a little bit more about that later, but I don't think I really want to do that today. So I guess I should have switched over here, huh? But yeah, so, and then the last thing we learned about is that in order to, you want to encrypt at rest, and to do that, you can use the GPG utility. You do have to install that. I don't think it comes default on any Linux distros that I'm familiar with, but you do have to install that, and then that will create a private and a public key. The default is RSA 2048. You can change that if you generate a full key, and there's instructions in the man page for how to do that. I'm not going to cover that today. So next time we'll take a look at rsync and how I use it. I prefer to use rsync, and I don't use NFS. Rsync is way faster than NFS at doing backups over the network. So until next time, I think we'll leave it there. And as always, I hope you enjoyed and maybe learned a little bit something about your Linux system, about some of its capabilities that are already there. If you did, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment. Either good or bad, that's fine. I learned from the bad ones just as much as I learned from the good ones. Hope to see you again, and bye for now.